The sound of car doors slamming at 3 in the morning wasn't what woke me. It was the jingling of keys at my front door, followed by hushed voices and muffled laughter. I lay in bed listening as my 32-year-old son Marcus let himself and someone else into the house Tom and I had worked 40 years to pay off. By the time I heard furniture being moved around in the guest bedroom, I knew exactly what was happening. Marcus had brought his latest girlfriend to live with us, and he hadn't bothered to ask permission. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I suppose I should have seen it coming. Marcus had always been the type to take what he wanted and assume forgiveness would follow. Even as a child, he'd raid the cookie jar, and then flash that charming smile when caught, crumbs still clinging to his lips. That smile had gotten him out of trouble more times than I could count, and apparently, he still believed it would work on his 67-year-old mother. My name is Eleanor Hartwell, and I've lived in the same split-level ranch house in Millbrook for 38 years. Tom and I bought it when Marcus was just a baby, scraping together every penny for the down payment while he slept in a bassinet we'd borrowed from my sister. The mortgage felt impossible then, but we made it work through overtime shifts at the textile plant where we both worked, Tom on the factory floor, and me in the office managing payroll. We weren't rich, but we were proud. Every month, we'd sit at the kitchen table with the bills spread out between us, calculating and recalculating until we were certain we could make ends meet. Tom would always set aside $20 for Marcus's college fund, no matter how tight things got. $20 might not seem like much, but over 18 years, it added up to enough for his first year at community college. Marcus had potential. His high school guidance counselor said he was smart enough for anything he set his mind to, but that was the problem. He never set his mind to anything for very long. College lasted exactly one semester before he decided formal education was holding him back from his entrepreneurial dreams. The construction job we helped him get through Tom's brother lasted 6 months before he quit, claiming his boss didn't appreciate his innovative ideas. The retail position at the electronics store ended when he was caught giving unauthorized discounts to his friends. Each failure came with elaborate explanations about how the system was rigged against creative thinkers like him. Each disappointment was followed by promises that the next opportunity would be different, better, the one that would finally showcase his true potential. Tom and I wanted to believe him. What parent doesn't want to believe their child will eventually find their way? The pattern became predictable. Marcus would lose a job or abandon a scheme, then show up at our door with that boyish grin and a story about temporary setbacks. He'd move into his old bedroom for what was supposed to be just a few weeks while he got back on his feet. Those few weeks invariably stretched into months, during which he'd eat our food, use our utilities, and leave his laundry scattered around the house, like territorial markers. Tom enabled him more than I did. Maybe it's different for fathers and sons, or maybe Tom saw something in Marcus that reminded him of his own younger, more optimistic self. Whatever the reason, Tom would slip Marcus money for job interviews that never seemed to materialize and gas money for opportunities that always fell through at the last minute. When I'd suggest that perhaps some tough love might motivate our son to become more self-sufficient, Tom would say Marcus just needed to find his niche. The girlfriends started appearing regularly after Marcus turned 25. Each one was going to be the one who helped him settle down, find direction, become the man we knew he could be. There was Jennifer, who lasted 3 months and left when she realized Marcus's business plan for a food truck was just a spiral notebook full of menu ideas. Then came Stephanie, who moved in with Marcus during one of his extended stays at our house and spent her days rearranging my kitchen to better suit her organic cooking philosophy. After Stephanie, I established what I thought was a reasonable boundary. No more girlfriends staying overnight without prior discussion. Our house wasn't a boarding facility for Marcus's romantic life, and I was tired of walking into my own kitchen to find strange women making themselves comfortable with my dishes and my coffee. Marcus agreed, of course. He always agreed to my conditions with the same easy smile that had charmed his way through 3 decades of broken promises. He'd nod earnestly and assure me he understood completely, that he respected our home and our rules. Then he'd promptly ignore everything he'd agreed to the moment it became inconvenient. The latest girlfriend was named Crystal, though I suspected that wasn't the name on her birth certificate. She was 24, bleached blonde, and had the kind of artificial nails that made me wonder how she managed simple tasks like typing or opening jars. Marcus had met her at a casino 3 hours away, which should have been my first warning that this relationship wasn't built on shared values or common interests. Crystal worked, if you could call it that, as what she described as a social media influencer. As far as I could determine, this meant she took pictures of herself in various outfits and locations, hoping companies would pay her to promote their products. She had approximately 3,000 followers, which seemed like a lot to me, until Tom looked it up and explained that successful influencers typically had millions of followers and made substantial incomes from their online presence. Marcus presented Crystal as his business partner in addition to his girlfriend. They were going to build an empire together, he explained, combining his entrepreneurial vision with her social media expertise. The plan, as he outlined it during one of his increasingly rare visits, involved creating viral content that would attract sponsors and eventually launch them into full-time influencer status. I listened to his presentation with the patience I'd developed over years of hearing similar schemes, nodding at appropriate intervals, and asking questions that I hoped sounded supportive rather than skeptical. How exactly would they create this viral content? What made them different from the millions of other people trying to make money through social media? How would they support themselves while building their audience? Marcus had answers for everything, delivered with the confidence of someone who'd never let practical considerations interfere with a good dream. They'd figured out the algorithm, he assured me. Crystal had connections in the industry. They just needed time and space to focus on their content creation without the distractions of traditional employment. The red flags were so numerous they could have formed their own parade, but pointing them out would only result in another lecture about how people of my generation didn't understand modern business models. I'd learned to keep my opinions to myself when it came to Marcus's ventures, partly because arguing never changed his mind, and partly because I secretly hoped that someday one of his wild ideas might actually succeed. Tom and I had been empty nesters for exactly 14 months before Marcus's latest crisis sent him back to our guest bedroom. This time, the crisis involved a multi-level marketing scheme that had promised unlimited earning potential selling nutritional supplements to friends and family. Marcus had invested his savings, Crystal's savings, and a significant amount borrowed from her father into inventory that was now stacked in our garage, because the market for overpriced vitamins had proven less robust than the recruitment presentation had suggested. The supplements represented the latest in a series of financial disasters that had begun with Marcus's attempt to day trade cryptocurrency, using money he'd borrowed against his car. That had been followed by his brief career as a real estate wholesaler, which ended when he realized that finding and acquiring properties required significantly more work than the online course had suggested. The nutritional supplements were supposed to be different because they offered residual income and the opportunity to help people improve their health while building wealth. Marcus had been living with us for 6 weeks when Crystal joined him permanently, though neither of them had officially announced the arrangement. She simply began appearing for dinner every night, leaving her makeup scattered across the guest bathroom counter, and parking her rusted Honda Civic in our driveway, like she belonged there. When I asked Marcus about the situation, he assured me it was temporary, just until they could get their business off the ground and find a place of their own. Temporary had a way of becoming permanent in Marcus's world. His childhood bedroom still contained the exercise equipment he'd bought during his brief fitness phase, the guitar he'd abandoned after 3 lessons, and the collection of business books he'd accumulated during various get-rich-quick obsessions. The garage held remnants of his previous ventures, a box of custom phone cases he'd planned to sell online, promotional materials for a lawn care service that never acquired any customers, and now the vitamin supplements that were supposed to fund his future. Crystal's presence changed the dynamics of our household in ways both subtle and obvious. She had strong opinions about everything from the temperature of the house to the brands of food in our refrigerator. She'd rearrange furniture to create better lighting for her photos, then leave it in the new configuration without asking if we minded. She used our Wi-Fi to stream videos while she worked out, slowing our internet connection to a crawl during the evening hours, when Tom and I typically watched television or video called our grandchildren. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in March. I'd spent the day at the senior center where I volunteered twice a week, helping elderly residents with their computer skills and organizing social activities. It was rewarding work that made me feel useful and connected to my community, a welcome change from the isolation I'd felt during Tom's final illness and the lonely months that followed his death. Tom had passed away 8 months earlier, suddenly and without warning, from a heart attack that struck while he was mowing the lawn on a Saturday morning in July. One moment he was complaining about the dandelions taking over the back corner of our property, and the next he was gone, leaving me with 38 years of shared memories and a mortgage that was finally, thankfully, paid off. Marcus had been supportive during Tom's funeral and the immediate aftermath, staying with me for 2 weeks and handling the practical arrangements that felt overwhelming in my grief. But as the initial shock wore off and life began to settle into its new rhythm, he'd returned to his old patterns of appearing when he needed something and disappearing when the novelty of family responsibility wore thin. The house felt enormous with just me in it. Rooms that had buzzed with activity when Marcus was young and Tom was alive now echoed with silence. I'd catch myself setting 2 places at dinner or buying Tom's favorite cereal out of habit, then feel the sharp pang of remembering that he wasn't coming home. The loneliness was worst in the evenings, when we used to sit together on the couch, Tom reading his newspaper while I worked on crossword puzzles or knitting projects. Having Marcus back in the house should have been comforting, a return to the bustle and energy of family life. Instead, it felt like an invasion. He and Crystal treated our home like their personal bed and breakfast, contributing nothing to household expenses or maintenance while consuming utilities, food and space with the casual entitlement of paying guests who'd forgotten they weren't actually paying. The evening that changed everything started like dozens of others. I came home from the senior center, tired but satisfied, after helping Mrs. Patterson finally master video calling so she could talk to her grandson in California. The simple joy on her face when his image appeared on her tablet screen had reminded me why I loved volunteer work. There was something deeply satisfying about teaching someone a new skill, about being the bridge between confusion and understanding. I pulled into my driveway behind Crystal's Honda and noticed immediately that something was different. The living room curtains were drawn, which was unusual since I always left them open to let in natural light. As I approached the front door, I could hear music playing inside, not the soft background music Tom and I had preferred, but something with a heavy bass line that seemed to pulse through the walls. My key turned in the lock, but the door only opened a few inches before hitting the security chain. The security chain that I never used because Tom and I had always felt safe in our quiet neighborhood, where the most exciting crime was Mrs. Henderson's ongoing war with the teenagers, who occasionally used her flower beds as a shortcut to the school bus stop. I knocked on my own front door and waited. The music stopped, and I heard hushed voices and shuffling footsteps. After several minutes, Marcus appeared, hair disheveled and wearing only a bathrobe at 6 o'clock in the evening. "Hey Mom," he said, making no move to remove the security chain. "I didn't know you were coming back so early. I live here," I reminded him, which shouldn't have been necessary but apparently was, "and it's 6 o'clock, which is when I always come home from the senior center on Tuesdays." He glanced back into the house, then returned his attention to me with that familiar sheepish expression that meant he'd been caught doing something he knew I wouldn't approve of. "Could you maybe give us like 15 minutes? We're in the middle of something important." Standing on my own front porch, locked out of the house I'd lived in for nearly 4 decades, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger exactly, though there was certainly some of that. It was more like clarity, the sudden sharp focus that comes when you realize you've been tolerating the intolerable for far too long. "Open the door, Marcus." "Mom, seriously, just 15 minutes. We're working on content for the business, and this is a really crucial. Open the door now, or I'm calling the police and having you both removed for trespassing." The threat surprised him, probably because I'd never made one like it before. In 32 years of parenting, I'd been the diplomatic one, the peacekeeper who found compromises and worked around problems, rather than confronting them directly. Tom had been the disciplinarian when Marcus was young, while I'd provided comfort and understanding when consequences became uncomfortable. Marcus stared at me for a long moment, perhaps trying to determine if I was bluffing. Whatever he saw in my expression convinced him I wasn't, because he stepped back and fumbled with the security chain until it finally released. I walked into my own living room and stopped short. The furniture had been rearranged to create what I can only describe as a photography studio. My sofa had been pushed against the wall, and my coffee table had been moved to the center of the room. Professional-looking lights on tall stands had been set up around the space, casting harsh shadows on the walls. A camera on a tripod was positioned to capture whatever had been happening on my coffee table. Crystal emerged from the hallway wearing a silk robe that barely covered her thighs and an expression of annoyance that suggested I was the one who didn't belong there. Her makeup was smeared, and her carefully styled hair looked like she'd been lying down. "We were almost finished," she said, not to me but to Marcus, as if I was an interruption rather than the homeowner. "Finished with what?" I asked, though I was beginning to suspect I didn't want to know the answer. Marcus and Crystal exchanged a look that communicated volumes. She shrugged and began gathering up items that I now realized were scattered across my coffee table. A bottle of massage oil, several pieces of lingerie that definitely hadn't come from any store I'd ever shopped in. Props that made my face burn with embarrassment and understanding. "It's not what you think," Marcus said quickly, which was exactly what someone says when it's precisely what you think. "We're building our brand," Crystal added, as if that explained everything. "Couples content gets really good engagement rates. It's totally artistic." I looked around my transformed living room, at the professional lighting and camera equipment, at the props and costumes that told a story I didn't want to imagine. My coffee table, where Tom and I had eaten countless dinners while watching television, where we'd played board games with young Marcus during family nights, where I'd signed the mortgage papers that had finally been burned in celebration just 5 years ago. "Get out," I said quietly. "Mom, let me explain. Both of you, pack your things and get out of my house." Crystal laughed, actually laughed, as if I'd told a particularly funny joke. "You can't be serious. Where are we supposed to go?" "I don't care where you go, I care that you go there immediately." Marcus stepped forward, and I saw him preparing to deploy the charm offensive that had worked so many times before. The boyish smile, the reasonable tone, the explanation that would somehow make this all seem like a misunderstanding, rather than a fundamental violation of respect and boundaries. "Mom, I know this looks bad, but if you'd just listen. I've been listening for 32 years, Marcus." "I'm done listening." The finality in my voice seemed to penetrate his disbelief. For the first time since I'd walked through my own front door to find strangers using my home as a set for their amateur adult entertainment business, he looked genuinely concerned. "You don't mean that." "I absolutely mean that. You have 2 hours to pack everything that belongs to you and leave. If you're not gone by 8 o'clock, I'm calling the police." Crystal had stopped gathering her props and was staring at me with undisguised hostility. "This is ridiculous. We're family, you can't just throw us out on the street." "We're not family," I told her, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "You're a stranger who's been living in my house, without permission, using my furniture as props for pornography." "It's not pornography," she snapped. "It's artistic expression. It's our business."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
"Then take your business somewhere else." I walked to my bedroom and closed the door, leaving them to argue in hushed tones in the living room. Through the walls, I could hear them moving furniture and equipment, probably hoping I'd change my mind if they cleaned up quickly enough. But something fundamental had shifted in me during those moments on my front porch, locked out of my own home while my son and his girlfriend treated my private space like their personal studio. 38 years I'd lived in that house. 38 years of mortgage payments, of maintenance and improvements, of creating a home that reflected the values Tom and I shared. We'd raised our son in those rooms, celebrated his achievements, comforted his disappointments, and welcomed his friends and later his girlfriends with the hospitality we'd been taught to show family and guests alike. But there was a difference between hospitality and being taken advantage of, between supporting your child and enabling their complete disrespect for boundaries and common decency. Marcus had crossed that line so far he couldn't even see it in his rearview mirror, and I'd allowed it to happen by making excuses and hoping he'd eventually mature into the man I'd always believed he could become. At 7:30, I heard car doors slamming. Through my bedroom window, I watched Marcus load boxes and equipment into Crystal's Honda while she sat in the passenger seat, smoking a cigarette and talking on her phone like she was coordinating with someone about their next accommodation. Marcus made 2 trips, then came back inside briefly before returning to the car with what looked like the last of their belongings. He knocked on my bedroom door, and I heard his voice through the wood, softer now, almost pleading. "Mom, I'm sorry about the misunderstanding. I never meant for you to see that stuff. Can we please talk about this tomorrow when everyone's had a chance to calm down?" I didn't answer. After a few minutes, his footsteps retreated down the hallway. The front door closed with a solid click, and car engines started in my driveway. I waited until the sound faded completely before emerging from my room. The living room looked almost normal. They'd moved the furniture back to its original positions and removed the lighting equipment and camera. But the space felt different somehow, violated in a way that wouldn't be fixed by simply rearranging the sofa and coffee table. I would need time to reclaim the room, to fill it again with memories that didn't involve discovering my son had been treating my home like a set for his girlfriend's online entertainment business. I made myself a cup of tea and sat in Tom's old recliner, trying to process what had just happened. For the first time in 8 months, the house was truly quiet, not the oppressive silence of loneliness, but the peaceful quiet of solitude. No one was streaming videos in the guest room. No one was rearranging my furniture for better lighting. No one was eating my food while complaining that I didn't stock the organic alternatives they preferred. The relief surprised me. I'd thought having Marcus back would fill some of the emptiness Tom's death had left, but instead, it had created a different kind of stress, the constant low-level tension of sharing space with people who didn't respect it. Now sitting in the quiet of my own home, I realized how much energy I'd been spending on managing their presence, on tiptoeing around their schedules and preferences, on biting my tongue when they treated my hospitality like an entitlement. The phone rang at 9:15. I glanced at the caller ID and saw Marcus's number, but I didn't answer. He called again at 9:30, then at 10 o'clock. Each time, I let it go to voicemail. Finally, curiosity got the better of me, and I played the messages. "Mom, this is crazy. We're staying at a motel, and it's costing us money we don't have. I know you're upset, but throwing us out isn't solving anything. Call me back so we can figure this out like adults." "Mom, it's Marcus again. Crystal's really upset, and honestly, so am I. We're family. Family doesn't abandon each other over misunderstandings. I thought you'd be proud that we're building a business together, that we're being entrepreneurial instead of just taking handouts. Call me back." "Mom, this is ridiculous. You can't stay mad forever. We'll get rid of the camera equipment if that's what's bothering you. We'll find somewhere else to work on our content, but we can't afford to stay in motels indefinitely. You know we're good for it once our business takes off. This is just a temporary setback." Each message revealed more about how Marcus saw the situation, and none of it suggested he understood what had actually upset me. He seemed to think the problem was the camera equipment or the inconvenience of discovering their activities unexpectedly. He genuinely appeared to believe that apologizing for the misunderstanding and promising to be more discreet would resolve everything and earn them readmission to my home. The deeper issue, the complete lack of respect for my space and boundary, the assumption that my home was available for whatever purposes they deemed appropriate, the casual entitlement that had led them to install security chains and lock me out of my own front door, none of that seemed to register as problematic behavior that might have consequences. I deleted the messages without calling back, and went to bed in my blessedly quiet house, sleeping better than I had in months. The campaign to wear down my resolve began the next morning. Marcus called while I was having breakfast, then again while I was getting dressed for my volunteer shift at the senior center. When I didn't answer, Crystal took over phone duties, leaving messages that started apologetic and grew increasingly demanding as the day progressed. "Mrs. Hartwell, this is Crystal. I want to apologize for yesterday. I think we got off on the wrong foot, and I'd really like to make things right. Could you please call me back so we can talk? I care about Marcus, and I know how much he loves you." "Mrs. Hartwell, it's Crystal again. I don't understand why you won't talk to us. We're trying to apologize, but you have to give us a chance. Marcus is really hurt that his own mother won't even return his calls. This isn't like you. Look, I don't know what your problem is, but you can't just throw people out with no warning. Marcus told me you've never acted like this before, so I don't know what's gotten into you, but this is really immature. We're staying at a motel that costs $60 a night, money we need for our business. You're sabotaging your own son's future over some stupid misunderstanding. The progression from apologetic to accusatory was fascinating in its predictability. They'd started by taking responsibility and expressing regret, then shifted to positioning themselves as the injured parties, and finally moved to blaming me for being unreasonable and vindictive. It was a masterclass in manipulation that probably worked on people who felt guilty about setting boundaries. But I didn't feel guilty. If anything, I felt liberated. For the first time in years, I was making decisions based on what I wanted and needed, rather than what would keep Marcus happy and prevent family drama. The house stayed clean because no one was leaving dishes in the sink or clothes scattered around the guest room. The utilities bills would be lower because no one was streaming videos or running professional lighting equipment. The refrigerator stayed full because no one was eating my groceries while contributing nothing to household expenses. At the senior center, I found myself more energetic and engaged than I'd been in months. Mrs. Patterson was making remarkable progress with her tablet skills, and I was able to help her set up video calls with 3 different grandchildren. Mr. Rodriguez had mastered email and was delighted to be corresponding with his army buddies from 50 years ago. The simple satisfaction of teaching and helping felt more meaningful than it had in a long time, perhaps because I was no longer preoccupied with the drama waiting for me at home. "You seem different today," Eleanor, commented Janet Morrison, who coordinated the volunteer program. "More relaxed somehow." I considered how to explain that I felt lighter because I'd finally stopped carrying the weight of other people's poor choices. "I made some changes at home that are working out well." "Good for you. Sometimes we all need to shake things up a bit." If she only knew how much I'd shaken things up, I thought, remembering Crystal's indignant voicemails about immaturity and sabotage. But Janet was right. Sometimes change was exactly what was needed, even when it felt scary or selfish or long overdue. The calls continued for the rest of the week. Marcus alternated between hurt confusion and frustrated anger, while Crystal's messages became increasingly hostile as the motel bills accumulated. They tried different approaches: promises to contribute to household expenses, offers to help with maintenance and repairs, elaborate explanations of how their business was on the verge of breakthrough success that would allow them to pay me back for everything. When emotional appeals didn't work, they moved to practical arguments. The motel was expensive and unsafe. Crystal's car was having mechanical problems, and they couldn't afford repairs while paying for lodging. Marcus's back was acting up from sleeping on a cheap mattress, and the stress was affecting his health. Surely I didn't want to be responsible for their hardship and suffering. Finally, when guilt and sympathy failed to produce results, they resorted to threats and ultimatums. If I didn't let them come home immediately, they might have to move to another state where living costs were lower. Marcus might not be able to continue their relationship if Crystal had to return to her parents in Minnesota. I was forcing him to choose between his mother and the woman he loved, and if I made him choose, I might not like the outcome. Each message revealed more about their character and their relationship dynamic. Marcus was weak and manipulative, accustomed to getting his way through emotional blackmail and the threat of withdrawal. Crystal was calculating and mercenary, more concerned with securing free housing than with genuine affection for my son. Together they formed a partnership built on mutual exploitation. She used him for financial support, and he used her to justify his irresponsible behavior. I began to understand that evicting them had been about more than protecting my home from their disrespectful behavior. It had been about forcing Marcus to confront reality for perhaps the first time in his adult life. No one was going to rescue him from the consequences of his choices. No one was going to provide free housing while he chased get-rich-quick schemes with women who saw him as a meal ticket rather than a life partner. The realization should have made me sad, but instead I felt oddly proud of myself. For 32 years, I'd enabled Marcus's refusal to grow up by cushioning every failure and providing safety nets that prevented him from learning from his mistakes. I'd told myself I was being supportive and loving, but actually, I'd been robbing him of the opportunity to develop resilience and self-reliance. By kicking him out, I'd given him something more valuable than free housing: the chance to discover what he was actually capable of when no one was there to catch him if he fell. It might be the most loving thing I'd ever done for him, even though he would probably never see it that way. After 2 weeks of daily calls and messages, the communication stopped abruptly. I waited several days before curiosity overcame my resolve not to engage, and I checked social media to see if I could learn what had happened to them. Crystal's Instagram account was still active, but the content had changed dramatically. Instead of the carefully posed couple photos and lifestyle content she'd been posting during her stay at my house, her recent posts showed her back in what appeared to be a small apartment, often alone, with captions about new beginnings and learning to trust herself. Marcus appeared in none of the recent photos. A week later, I found his Facebook profile, which he'd updated to show he was single and living in a city 2 states away. Apparently, their great love story had ended when the free housing ran out, and they'd been forced to confront the reality of their incompatible goals and artificial connection. I felt no satisfaction in their breakup, but I did feel vindicated in my assessment of their relationship. Without the comfortable nest of my home to cushion them from consequences, they'd quickly discovered that they had little in common beyond a shared willingness to take advantage of other people's generosity. 3 months passed before Marcus contacted me again. This time, it wasn't a phone call or voicemail, but a text message that arrived on a Thursday afternoon, while I was helping Mrs. Chen learn to use online banking. "Mom, I know you're probably still angry, but I wanted you to know I got a job. Real job, not some scheme. Working at a factory in Ohio. $12 an hour to start, but they offer overtime and benefits after 90 days. I'm renting a room from an older couple who needed help with their mortgage. I pay them $300 a month plus 20 hours of yard work and repairs. It's not glamorous, but it's honest work, and I'm making it on my own." I read the message 3 times before responding. "I'm proud of you." His reply came immediately. "I'm sorry about what happened at your house. I never meant to disrespect you or Dad's memory. I was just so desperate to make something work, to prove I wasn't a failure, that I lost sight of what was actually important. I hope someday you'll forgive me. I forgave you the day I asked you to leave. Sometimes loving someone means refusing to enable them. I think I'm finally starting to understand that. I'll call you this weekend if that's okay. I'd like to hear about your volunteer work and how you're doing." "I'd like that too." We talked for an hour that Saturday, the first real conversation we'd had in years. Marcus told me about his job at the automotive parts factory, about his landlords who reminded him of Tom and me when we were younger, about the satisfaction of earning enough money to cover his basic expenses without having to chase schemes or depend on other people's charity. I told him about the senior center and the computer classes, about Mrs. Patterson's video calls with her grandchildren and Mr. Rodriguez's email correspondence with old Army friends. I told him about the peace I'd found living alone, about rediscovering interests and activities that had been overshadowed by years of managing other people's crises and expectations. "You sound happy, Mom." "I am happy. For the first time in a long time, I'm genuinely happy." "I'm glad. You deserve to be happy. You spent so many years taking care of Dad and me. I don't think I ever considered what you might want for yourself." It was a remarkably mature observation from someone who'd spent most of his adult life focused exclusively on his own desires and schemes. Perhaps losing Crystal and his comfortable nest at my house had forced him to develop empathy along with self-reliance. We established a pattern of weekly phone calls that continued through the summer and into fall. Marcus shared updates about his job performance and his growing friendship with his landlords, who were teaching him practical skills like plumbing repair and garden maintenance. I shared stories from the senior center and updates about neighborhood events and changes. The conversations felt different from our previous interactions. Instead of Marcus asking for money or help, he offered both. When I mentioned that my washing machine was making strange noises, he researched the problem online and walked me through some diagnostic steps that solved the issue without requiring a repair call. When I expressed concern about climbing on a ladder to clean my gutters, he offered to drive down for a weekend and take care of it himself. "You don't owe me any favors, Marcus. I'm proud of you for building an independent life. I'm not offering because I owe you. I'm offering because I love you, and taking care of people you love is what family does." It was exactly the attitude I'd hoped to instill in him during all those years of unconditional support and second chances, and it had finally emerged only after I'd stopped providing those things. The irony wasn't lost on me, but it also wasn't bitter. Sometimes the longest path to wisdom is the only one that works. Marcus visited for Thanksgiving, his first trip home since the evening I'd found him and Crystal using my living room as an adult film studio. He looked different, thinner, more weathered, but also more solid somehow, like someone who'd been tested and discovered he was stronger than he'd believed. He brought gifts, a photo album he'd made of family pictures from his childhood, a handmade cutting board his landlord had taught him to craft in their workshop, and a check for $500. "What's this for?" I asked, holding the check. "It's not nearly enough to repay what I owe you, but it's a start. All those years you supported me, all those times you bailed me out when I made stupid decisions, all the free housing and food and utilities." I kept a rough tally, and even with compound interest, it's going to take me a while to pay back, but I intend to do it. I tried to hand the check back to him. "I don't want your money, Marcus. I wanted your respect, and I have that now. Keep it anyway. Not as repayment for past debts, but as proof that I'm finally capable of contributing instead of just taking. Dad always said a man pays his own way in the world." It took me 32 years to understand what he meant. We spent the weekend working together on small home improvement projects, Marcus applying the skills he'd learned from his landlords while I provided supervision and occasional assistance. It felt like the kind of relationship I'd always hoped we'd have, two adults who cared about each other and showed that caring through actions rather than words. On Sunday evening, as he prepared to drive back to Ohio, Marcus lingered by his car like he had something more to say. "Mom, I need you to know something. What happened with Crystal, with the camera and all that stuff in your living room, it wasn't the first time. We'd been doing that kind of content for months, using different locations, sometimes people's houses when they weren't home. I told myself it was just business, just a way to build our brand and make money, but really I knew it was wrong." The confession hung in the air between us like smoke from a fire that had finally burned itself out. Marcus stood beside his car, hands shoved deep in his pockets, unable to meet my eyes as he admitted what I'd already suspected but hadn't wanted to believe. The camera equipment, the professional lighting, the casual way they'd rearranged my furniture, it had all been too practiced, too efficient for amateurs figuring things out as they went. I felt the familiar weight of disappointment settle in my chest, but it was different this time, muted somehow by the distance that had grown between his problems and my peace of mind. 6 months ago, this revelation would have devastated me, would have sent me into sleepless nights wondering where I'd gone wrong as a mother, what I could have done differently to prevent my son from making such choices. Now it felt like confirmation of a painful truth I'd already accepted and moved beyond. After Marcus drove away, I went inside and made myself a cup of tea, settling into Tom's old recliner with a book I'd been meaning to finish for weeks. The house felt quiet and clean and wholly mine, filled with the comfortable silence of a space that belonged to someone who respected it. I thought about Marcus's confession, about the months of deception that had culminated in that awful evening when I'd discovered their activities in my living room, and I realized that my anger had transformed into something closer to relief. Relief that I'd trusted my instincts when they told me something was fundamentally wrong. Relief that I'd found the strength to draw boundaries even when it meant disappointing someone I loved. Relief that Marcus was finally taking responsibility for his choices instead of expecting me to manage the consequences for him. The next few months passed peacefully. Marcus called every Sunday, sharing updates about his work at the factory and his growing competence with practical skills like automotive repair and home maintenance. His landlords, Frank and Dorothy Kowalski, had become surrogate parents in some ways, teaching him the kinds of life lessons Tom and I had tried to instill during his childhood, but which he'd been too entitled and impatient to absorb. Frank was a retired electrician who'd spent 40 years working construction and had strong opinions about work ethic and personal responsibility. Dorothy had raised 5 children on a teacher's salary, while managing a household with the efficiency of a military quartermaster. Together they provided Marcus with the structure and accountability he'd never accepted from Tom and me, perhaps because we'd been too invested in his happiness to demand his growth. Under their guidance, Marcus learned to budget his paychecks, maintaining a simple spreadsheet that tracked every expense and ensured he always had enough money for rent, utilities, and basic necessities, before spending anything on entertainment or luxuries. He learned to cook simple, nutritious meals instead of relying on fast food and frozen dinners. He learned to maintain his car, his clothing, and his living space with the kind of attention to detail that prevented small problems from becoming expensive emergencies. Most importantly, he learned to find satisfaction in work that wasn't glamorous or exciting but provided steady income and the dignity of earning his place in the world through honest effort. The factory job involved repetitive assembly line work that required focus and consistency rather than creativity or innovation. But Marcus discovered that there was deep satisfaction in performing simple tasks well, in being someone his supervisors could depend on to show up on time and complete his assignments without supervision. I watched this transformation from a distance, proud of his progress but determined not to insert myself back into his life as a safety net or enabler. The weekly phone calls were enough to maintain our connection while preserving the independence that had been so crucial to his development. When he mentioned challenges or setbacks, I listened supportively but resisted the urge to offer solutions or financial assistance that might undermine his growing self-reliance. My own life had expanded to fill the space that had once been consumed by Marcus's crises and needs. The volunteer work at the senior center became increasingly rewarding as I developed deeper relationships with the residents and took on additional responsibilities. I started a weekly computer literacy class that drew participants from across the county, many of them driving significant distances to learn skills that would help them stay connected with family members or manage their finances online. The success of the computer classes led to other opportunities. The county library asked me to develop a similar program for their patrons, and soon I was spending 3 days a week teaching digital skills to people ranging from their 50s to their 90s. The work was challenging in the best possible way, requiring me to adapt my teaching methods to different learning styles and comfort levels, while maintaining patience with students who sometimes struggled with concepts that seemed basic to younger generations. Beyond the volunteer work, I rediscovered interests and activities that had been dormant during the years I'd spent managing Tom's illness and Marcus's various crises. I joined a book club at the library, started taking watercolor painting classes at the community college, and began attending evening lectures on topics ranging from local history to astronomy. For the first time in decades, my schedule reflected my own interests and priorities rather than other people's emergencies and expectations. The social aspect of these activities was as valuable as the intellectual stimulation. I'd forgotten how much I enjoyed the company of people who shared my curiosity about the world, who engaged in conversations about ideas rather than complaints about circumstances. The friendships I developed were based on mutual interests and genuine compatibility rather than family obligation or proximity, and they enriched my life in ways I hadn't anticipated. Helen Morrison, whom I met in the watercolor class, became a particularly close friend. She was a retired nurse who'd moved to town to be closer to her daughter, but had found herself feeling isolated and purposeless after a lifetime of demanding, meaningful work. Like me, she'd discovered that volunteer work and creative pursuits could provide the sense of contribution and accomplishment that retirement had temporarily removed from her life. Helen and I developed a routine of meeting for coffee every Tuesday morning, discussing everything from local politics to family relationships with the kind of honesty and insight that comes from years of experience, and the freedom that accompanies no longer needing to impress anyone. She'd been married for 38 years before her husband's death from cancer, and she understood both the grief of widowhood and the unexpected liberation that could emerge from it. I loved Robert dearly, she told me one morning as we sat in the corner booth at Murphy's Diner, watching the early commuters grab their coffee and pastries before heading to work. But after he died, I realized how much of my identity had been tied up in being his wife, in managing his care during his illness, in organizing our social life around his preferences and limitations. I felt guilty about enjoying my freedom, but I couldn't deny that it felt good to make decisions based solely on what I wanted to do. I understood exactly what she meant. Tom's death had been devastating, but the aftermath had revealed possibilities I'd forgotten existed. Without the need to coordinate schedules or compromise on activities, I'd been able to explore interests that had been dormant for years. The guilt Helen described was familiar, the sense that enjoying my independence somehow dishonored the memory of my marriage, but it had gradually given way to gratitude for both the years I'd shared with Tom and the opportunity to discover who I was outside the context of that relationship. The conversation reminded me of something Marcus had said during one of our Sunday calls, about learning to find satisfaction in simple work rather than constantly chasing grand dreams of wealth and success. Perhaps contentment was always about appreciating what you had, rather than focusing on what you lacked, whether that was a steady job or a quiet house, or the freedom to paint watercolors on Tuesday afternoons. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came a restless energy that made me want to tackle projects I'd been postponing. I hired a landscaping service to redesign the front garden, replacing the overgrown shrubs Tom had planted 20 years earlier with a more modern arrangement that required less maintenance. I had the interior of the house painted in colors I'd always loved but had never suggested because Tom preferred neutral tones. I bought new furniture for the living room, choosing pieces based on my own comfort and aesthetic preferences rather than their durability for family gatherings that rarely happened anymore. Each change made the house feel more like my space rather than a museum preserving the memory of our family life. I kept Tom's recliner and the photographs that marked important milestones, but I also created room for new memories and experiences. The guest bedroom, which had housed Marcus during his various stays, became a craft room where I could work on painting projects and store the supplies for my volunteer teaching. The transformation wasn't just physical. I'd developed a confidence in my own judgment that had been missing during the years when I'd constantly second-guessed my parenting decisions or deferred to Tom's preferences in household matters. Living alone had taught me to trust my instincts about everything from financial decisions to social commitments, and that self-trust had spilled over into other areas of my life. When the senior center asked me to coordinate a fundraising event for new computer equipment, I accepted the challenge without the self-doubt that might have paralyzed me in the past. The event required months of planning and coordination with local businesses, community organizations, and volunteers, but I approached each task with the systematic problem-solving skills I'd developed during my years as a working mother and caregiver. The fundraiser was a remarkable success, raising enough money to purchase 10 new tablets and update the center's internet infrastructure to support increased usage. More importantly, it demonstrated to myself and others that I was capable of leadership and achievement that had nothing to do with my roles as wife and mother. The recognition felt different from the appreciation I'd received for family caregiving. It was based on my abilities and efforts rather than my relationships and obligations. Marcus called the evening after the fundraiser, having seen a photo of the event in the local newspaper that someone had shared on social media. "Mom, I saw the article about your computer fundraiser. That's incredible. You raised $12,000. $13,000 actually." The final donations came in after the reporter's deadline. There was genuine admiration in his voice, and I realized it might be the first time he'd thought of me as someone with achievements and capabilities that existed independently of my relationship to him. During his childhood and young adulthood, I'd been primarily a source of support and resources, someone whose value was measured by my willingness to help him rather than my own accomplishments. It was a team effort, but I did discover that I enjoy project management more than I expected. Dad would have been so proud too. "You're really building something amazing with that volunteer work." The mention of Tom was casual and comfortable rather than carefully navigated, another sign that time and distance had allowed our family relationships to evolve in healthy directions. Marcus could acknowledge his father's memory without the defensive guilt that had characterized many of our conversations in the months immediately following Tom's death. We talked for nearly an hour about the fundraiser, about Marcus's increasing responsibilities at the factory, about his landlord's ongoing renovation projects, about my painting classes and book club meetings. The conversation felt like an exchange between two adults who cared about each other's lives rather than a report from a dependent child to a worried parent. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen looking at the newspaper clipping Marcus had seen, a photo of me presenting the donation check to the senior center director while surrounded by volunteers and community supporters. I looked confident and engaged, like someone who belonged in that leadership role rather than someone who'd stumbled into it by accident. The woman in the photograph bore little resemblance to the person I'd been 2 years earlier, when Marcus and Crystal had been living in my house, and I'd felt like a stranger in my own home. That version of myself had been reactive and accommodating, constantly adjusting her environment and expectations to manage other people's comfort and avoid conflict. The person in the photo looked proactive and centered, someone who'd learned to create the life she wanted rather than simply enduring the circumstances she'd been given. Summer brought new challenges and opportunities. The success of the computer fundraiser led to invitations to serve on the boards of 2 other community organizations, both of which were looking for members with event planning experience and fundraising skills. I accepted one position, with the Literacy Council, and politely declined the other, having learned that being selective about commitments was as important as being willing to contribute. The Literacy Council work involved developing programs to help adults improve their reading and writing skills, often working with people who'd left school early to support their families, or who'd struggled with learning disabilities that hadn't been properly diagnosed or addressed during their formal education. The work was challenging and rewarding in different ways, from the computer classes, requiring patience and sensitivity as I helped people overcome not just skill gaps, but also the shame and embarrassment that often accompanied illiteracy. One of my students was a 50-year-old man named Robert Chen, who'd immigrated to the United States 20 years earlier, but had never learned to read English beyond the basic vocabulary required for his job in a restaurant kitchen. His daughter, now in college, had been translating important documents and helping him navigate bureaucratic processes for years, but she'd encouraged him to develop independence in these areas before she graduated and potentially moved away for career opportunities. Robert was intelligent and motivated, but had been intimidated by formal educational settings that reminded him of early experiences with language barriers and cultural misunderstandings. Working with him required developing materials and approaches that built on his existing knowledge and life experience, rather than treating him as a beginning student who knew nothing about communication or problem solving. Over the course of several months, I watched Robert's confidence grow as his reading skills progressed from laboriously sounding out individual words to reading complete sentences and paragraphs with comprehension and fluency. More importantly, he began to see himself as someone capable of learning and growth, rather than someone whose educational limitations were fixed and unchangeable. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said during one of our sessions, looking up from a news article he'd just read aloud without assistance, "I never thought I could do this. My daughter, she always tell me I'm smart, but I don't believe her because I cannot read like American people. Now I think maybe she is right." The pride in his voice was unmistakable, and it reminded me of the satisfaction I'd felt when Marcus had called to share news of his job promotion, or his latest accomplishment in Frank and Dorothy's workshop. There was something deeply fulfilling about witnessing someone discover capabilities they doubted they possessed, whether that person was your adult child, learning to manage his own life, or a middle-aged immigrant mastering skills that would increase his independence and confidence. The parallel between Robert's journey and Marcus's wasn't lost on me. Both men had needed to develop abilities that would reduce their dependence on others. Robert on his daughter's translation and advocacy, Marcus on my financial and emotional support. Both had benefited from patient, consistent guidance that respected their dignity while challenging them to grow beyond their perceived limitations. The difference was that I'd been able to maintain appropriate boundaries with Robert from the beginning, offering assistance and encouragement without becoming personally invested in his success, to the point where it compromised my own well-being. With Marcus, it had taken years of enabling and disappointment before I'd learned to separate his problems from my responsibilities, his choices from my worth as a parent. Helen and I discussed this insight during one of our Tuesday coffee meetings, as we often explored the lessons that emerged from our volunteer work and family relationships. She'd been struggling with similar issues involving her son David, who'd moved back to her city after a divorce, and had been making increasing demands on her time and emotional energy. "The hardest part," she confided, stirring her coffee thoughtfully, "is knowing when helping becomes hurting. David needs support right now, and I want to provide that, but I also see how easily he slips into expecting me to manage things he should be handling himself. How do you find the balance between being loving and being enabling?" It was a question I'd wrestled with for years, before finally learning to prioritize boundaries over harmony. I think the key is asking whether your help is building their capacity or substituting for it. When I was doing Marcus's laundry and paying his bills, and providing free housing with no expectations or time limits, I was substituting for his adult capabilities. When you translate documents for Robert but also teach him to read so he can eventually do it himself, you're building his capacity. But what if they get angry when you stop substituting? David has made it clear that he thinks I'm being selfish and unsupportive when I suggest he handle certain things independently. Then you know you're doing the right thing. People who are genuinely grateful for help don't get angry when you encourage their independence. They might feel frustrated or challenged, but they don't attack your character for refusing to enable their dependence. Helen nodded slowly, recognizing the truth in what I'd said, but still struggling with the guilt that accompanied setting boundaries with someone she loved. I understood her difficulty because I'd experienced it myself, the way that loving someone could become a trap if you confuse support with enabling, care with control. The conversation stayed with me as summer progressed into fall, particularly as I prepared for Marcus's second Thanksgiving visit since our relationship had transformed. His phone calls had become even more positive over the past few months, filled with news of increased responsibilities at work, deepening friendships with Frank and Dorothy, and small but significant improvements in his financial stability and personal confidence. "Mom, I wanted to tell you before I come for Thanksgiving. I've been seeing someone," he announced during one of our Sunday calls. "Her name is Jennifer, and she's different from anyone I've dated before. She works as a dental hygienist, has her own apartment, drives a reliable car that she bought herself. We met at a community college class Frank convinced me to take." I felt a familiar flutter of anxiety at the mention of a new girlfriend, memories of Crystal and Stephanie, and the other women who'd contributed to Marcus's various schemes and disasters. But I caught myself before responding with questions or concerns that would signal a lack of trust in his judgment. "Tell me about her," I said instead, keeping my voice neutral and interested. "She's 28, originally from Wisconsin but moved here for her job about 3 years ago. She's taking business classes at night because she wants to open her own dental practice someday. She's practical and goal-oriented, but she's also funny and kind. She makes me want to be better than I am." The description was encouraging, particularly the part about Jennifer having her own career and financial stability. Crystal had been entirely dependent on Marcus's schemes and my resources, while Jennifer appeared to be someone with her own ambitions and means of supporting herself. More importantly, Marcus sounded different when he talked about her, more thoughtful and less obsessed with impressing her or winning her approval.
How did you meet her? Frank enrolled me in an accounting class because he thought it would help me understand business finances better. Jennifer was taking the same class because she needs those skills for her future practice. We started studying together, and it just developed from there. She doesn't know about my past mistakes, the schemes and failures, and all the times I disappointed you and Dad. I mean, she knows I'm working at rebuilding my life, but she doesn't know the details. I heard the uncertainty in his voice, the fear that his history of poor choices and irresponsible behavior would contaminate this new relationship if Jennifer learned the complete truth. It was a reasonable concern, but also an opportunity for him to practice the honesty and vulnerability that healthy relationships required. "Marcus, if Jennifer is the kind of person you want to build a future with, she needs to know who you really are, including the mistakes you've made and the lessons you've learned from them. Someone who would reject you for having a complicated past isn't someone who would support you through future challenges. But what if she decides I'm not worth the risk? What if she thinks I'm going to revert to those old patterns and drag her down with me? Then you'll know she's not the right person for you. But if she's as practical and goal-oriented as you say, she'll probably appreciate your honesty and the evidence that you've learned from your experiences. The fact that you're worried about being worthy of her suggests you've developed the kind of self-awareness that makes future mistakes less likely." We talked for another few minutes about his relationship concerns and his plans for gradually sharing more of his history with Jennifer. I was struck by how mature and thoughtful he sounded, how different this conversation was from our previous discussions about his romantic relationships, which had typically involved either wild enthusiasm for someone's supposed potential or frustrated complaints about their failure to appreciate his vision. After we hung up, I realized I was looking forward to meeting Jennifer during the Thanksgiving visit, not with the protective anxiety I'd felt about Marcus's previous girlfriends, but with genuine curiosity about someone who'd apparently earned his respect and inspired his growth. The shift in my own attitude reflected the changes in our relationship. I was no longer responsible for managing his choices or protecting him from their consequences, which freed me to simply be interested in his life rather than worried about it. The evening before Thanksgiving, Marcus called to let me know he and Jennifer were driving down together and would arrive the following morning. "I hope it's okay that I invited her to come with me. She doesn't have family nearby, and I thought it would be nice for you to meet her." "Of course it's okay. I'm looking forward to meeting someone who's made such a positive impression on you." "Mom, there's something else I need to tell you. Jennifer knows about what happened with Crystal, about why I had to leave your house. I told her because I didn't want her to hear it from someone else or discover it by accident. She was surprised, but she said everyone has parts of their past they're not proud of, and what matters is who you choose to become after you learn better. The maturity of both Marcus's decision to be honest and Jennifer's response to his confession was encouraging. It suggested that this relationship was based on mutual respect and realistic expectations rather than fantasy and manipulation. She sounds like a wise young woman. She is. I think you're going to like her, and I hope she likes you too. I've told her so much about your volunteer work and the fundraising project. She's really impressed by everything you've accomplished. The comment surprised me because I hadn't realized Marcus had been paying such close attention to my activities or that he'd been sharing them with Jennifer. During the years when he'd been living with various girlfriends and chasing different schemes, our conversations had focused almost exclusively on his problems and plans, with minimal attention to my interests or achievements. I'm honored that you've been talking about me positively. Mom, I know I spent a lot of years taking you for granted, treating you like you existed just to solve my problems and fund my mistakes. But watching you build this whole new life for yourself, seeing how confident and successful you've become, it's made me realize how incredible you are. I want Jennifer to know that my mother is someone worth admiring. The conversation left me feeling emotionally complicated in ways I wasn't sure how to process. I was grateful for Marcus's recognition and appreciation, but I also felt somewhat sad that it had taken him 33 years to see me as a person with my own worth and accomplishments, rather than just someone whose value was measured by her usefulness to him. At the same time, I recognized that my own growth had been part of what had enabled him to see me differently. The version of myself who'd been constantly managing his crises and enabling his dependence hadn't been living a life that demonstrated independence or achievement. I'd been so focused on supporting other people's dreams and potential that I'd forgotten to develop my own, so invested in being needed that I'd never created space to be admired for my own capabilities. The transformation had been mutual. As I'd learned to set boundaries and pursue my own interests, Marcus had been forced to develop self-reliance and had gained the perspective to appreciate what I'd sacrificed for his benefit. Neither of us could have reached this point without the painful but necessary separation that had allowed us both to grow into healthier versions of ourselves. Thanksgiving morning arrived gray and cool, with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything feel sharper and more alive. I spent the early hours preparing dishes I'd been making for decades: herb stuffing cranberry sauce from scratch, sweet potato casserole with the marshmallow topping Marcus had loved since childhood. But I also tried a new recipe for Brussels sprouts with bacon and balsamic vinegar, something I'd never made when Tom was alive, because he disliked Brussels sprouts in any form. The cooking process felt different this year, more relaxed and creative than the dutiful meal preparation of previous holidays. I wasn't cooking to meet other people's expectations or recreate traditions that had become routine rather than meaningful. Instead, I was creating a meal that reflected my current tastes and interests, incorporating new elements while preserving the dishes that genuinely brought me joy to make. Marcus and Jennifer arrived at 11, and I watched through the front window as they unloaded their car with the efficient coordination of people who'd traveled together before. Jennifer was shorter than I'd expected, with shoulder-length brown hair and a practical wardrobe that suggested someone who dressed for comfort and function rather than impression. She moved with the confident competence I associated with healthcare professionals, someone accustomed to putting people at ease in potentially stressful situations. Marcus looked good, healthier and more substantial than he had during his previous visit, with the kind of physical presence that comes from regular work and adequate rest. More importantly, he looked relaxed in a way I hadn't seen since his teenage years, before the pressure of adult expectations had sent him spiraling through various schemes and disasters. "Mom, this is Jennifer," Marcus said as they approached the front door, his arm around her waist in a gesture that seemed natural rather than possessive. "Jennifer, this is my mother, Eleanor, Mrs. Hartwell. It's so wonderful to meet you," Jennifer said, extending her hand with a firm grip and direct eye contact. "Marcus has told me so much about you and your volunteer work. I'm really impressed by everything you've accomplished with the Senior Center and the Literacy Council." Her enthusiasm seemed genuine rather than performative, and I found myself genuinely pleased by her interest in my activities rather than simply polite about her presence in my home. We spent the first hour of their visit touring the house and discussing the changes I'd made since Marcus's last visit, the new furniture in the living room, the craft room that had replaced the guest bedroom, the updated garden that was now dormant but showed signs of the spring growth to come. Jennifer asked thoughtful questions about my painting classes and computer teaching, demonstrating both genuine curiosity and enough knowledge to maintain intelligent conversation. She'd done volunteer work with a literacy program in Wisconsin before moving to our state, and she understood both the challenges and rewards of helping adults develop new skills. "It's such meaningful work," she said as we looked at some of my watercolor attempts displayed in the craft room. "And you're obviously talented at teaching if you're getting the kind of results Marcus described. It takes special patience and insight to help people overcome their fears about learning. I think it helps that I understand what it feels like to discover you're capable of things you never thought you could do. A few years ago, I would never have imagined coordinating a major fundraiser or serving on community boards. Sometimes we have to surprise ourselves." Jennifer smiled. Marcus said something similar about his factory work. He never thought he'd find satisfaction in manufacturing, but he says there's something deeply rewarding about doing practical work well and being part of a team that depends on each other. The comment revealed that Marcus had been thoughtful and honest in his conversations with Jennifer about his work and personal development, another encouraging sign that this relationship was based on realistic appreciation rather than mutual fantasy. She wasn't trying to change him into someone more exciting or ambitious, and he wasn't trying to impress her with schemes or promises he couldn't fulfill. Dinner conversation flowed easily among the three of us, covering topics ranging from Jennifer's plans for dental practice ownership to Marcus's increasing involvement in Frank and Dorothy's home renovation projects to my upcoming responsibilities with the Literacy Council's annual fundraising campaign. For the first time in years, our family gathering felt like an exchange among equals rather than a performance designed to maintain peace or manage someone's emotional needs. Jennifer fit naturally into our conversation, contributing her own experiences and perspectives without trying to dominate or redirect attention to herself. She listened attentively when Marcus and I shared memories of past Thanksgivings with Tom, and she offered appropriate comments without trying to insert herself into family history that predated her presence. Most importantly, she seemed to bring out aspects of Marcus's personality that had been dormant during his relationship with Crystal and his earlier romantic disasters. He was more thoughtful and considerate, more interested in other people's experiences than in promoting his own agenda. He asked detailed questions about my recent projects and seemed genuinely proud of my accomplishments, rather than simply pleased that I was occupied with activities that didn't require anything from him. After dinner, Marcus insisted on handling the cleanup, while Jennifer and I continued talking in the living room. I found myself genuinely enjoying her company, appreciating both her intelligence and her straightforward communication style. She didn't seem to be performing for my approval or trying to manage my impression of her relationship with Marcus. "Mrs. Hartwell, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but Marcus talks about you with such admiration and respect. He's told me about the difficult years when he was struggling to find direction, and he's very aware of how much patience and support you provided during that time. He's also incredibly proud of how you've built this independent, fulfilling life for yourself. It's taken me a while to learn that supporting someone and enabling them are different things. I had to stop managing Marcus's problems before either of us could grow into healthier versions of ourselves." Jennifer nodded thoughtfully. "That must have been incredibly difficult, especially after losing your husband. It would have been so much easier to let Marcus stay dependent on you rather than dealing with the conflict that comes with setting boundaries." Her insight impressed me because it demonstrated understanding of the emotional complexity involved in changing long-standing family dynamics. Many people assumed that setting boundaries was simply a matter of being firm or selfish, without recognizing the grief and guilt that accompanied watching someone you love struggle with consequences you could easily prevent. The hardest part was accepting that I couldn't love Marcus into maturity. I had to let him discover his own capabilities and develop his own motivation for growth. As long as I was solving his problems, he had no reason to develop problem-solving skills. I can see the results of that difficult decision. Marcus is one of the most responsible and self-aware men I've ever dated. He knows what he's capable of because he's tested those capabilities, and he knows what he values because he's had to choose his priorities carefully. A lot of men our age are still figuring out those basic things. The conversation continued for another hour, covering everything from Jennifer's career goals, to her observations about Marcus's relationship with Frank and Dorothy, to her own experiences with family boundaries and expectations. I found myself hoping that this relationship would continue to develop because Jennifer seemed to be exactly the kind of partner Marcus needed. Someone who appreciated his growth without trying to accelerate it. Someone who had her own ambitions and wouldn't become dependent on his success for her sense of worth. When Marcus finished the dishes and rejoined us, the easy dynamic among the three of us resumed naturally. We played a few hands of cards, watched part of a movie, and continued the kind of relaxed conversation that characterizes successful family gatherings. By the time they prepared to leave on Friday afternoon, I felt like Jennifer had become a genuine addition to our family, rather than simply Marcus's girlfriend who happened to be present. Mrs. Hartwell, thank you so much for including me in your Thanksgiving, Jennifer said as she hugged me goodbye. I hope we'll have many more opportunities to spend time together. I hope so too. You're welcome here anytime, and I'd love to hear how your business planning progresses. After they left, I cleaned up the few remaining dishes and settled into my quiet house with a sense of satisfaction I hadn't felt after a family gathering in years. Instead of feeling drained by the effort of managing personalities and avoiding conflict, I felt energized by the genuine connection and mutual respect that had characterized our time together. The visit had demonstrated how much our family dynamic had improved since Marcus and I had learned to relate to each other as independent adults, rather than as dependent child and enabling parent. We could enjoy each other's company without the underlying tension that had pervaded our interactions when his presence in my home had been accompanied by financial dependence and boundary violations. More importantly, I'd seen evidence that Marcus had genuinely internalized the lessons he'd learned during his period of forced independence. His relationship with Jennifer was based on mutual respect and realistic expectations, rather than fantasy and manipulation. His satisfaction with steady work and modest achievements suggested that he'd developed the kind of internal motivation that could sustain long-term growth and stability. December brought new challenges and opportunities that tested my growing confidence in both my professional capabilities and my family relationships. The Literacy Council asked me to represent our organization at a statewide conference on adult education, which would involve presenting our program's methods and outcomes to an audience of educators and administrators from across the region. The invitation was both flattering and terrifying. I'd never given a formal presentation to a professional audience, and the prospect of standing in front of dozens of experts to discuss work I'd learned through trial and error rather than formal training felt overwhelming. But it was also an opportunity to share approaches that had proven effective with my students and potentially influence programming decisions that could benefit adult learners throughout the state. Helen encouraged me to accept the invitation, pointing out that my practical experience and evident success with diverse learners were exactly what the conference organizers were seeking. You've developed effective methods through direct work with students, she argued during one of our coffee meetings. That's more valuable than theoretical knowledge that hasn't been tested in real situations. I spent several weeks preparing for the presentation, organizing my thoughts about effective teaching strategies and gathering examples of student progress that could illustrate key points without violating anyone's privacy. The process of articulating my approaches forced me to recognize how much expertise I'd developed through my volunteer work, how many problems I'd solved, and insights I'd gained through careful attention to individual student needs. The conference was held in the state capitol, requiring an overnight trip that felt like a significant adventure after years of rarely traveling beyond our county. I stayed in a hotel near the convention center and spent the evening before my presentation reviewing my notes and trying to manage the nervous excitement that accompanied this new challenge. The presentation went better than I'd dared to hope. The audience was engaged and asked thoughtful questions about adapting methods for different types of learners and different educational goals. Several attendees approached me afterward to request additional information about specific techniques, and the conference organizer asked if I'd be willing to participate in future events. More importantly, the experience taught me that I could succeed in professional contexts that had once seemed intimidatingly beyond my capabilities. Standing in front of that audience, sharing knowledge I'd gained through dedicated work, I felt the same kind of competence and satisfaction I'd experienced during the computer fundraiser, but amplified by the recognition that my insights had value beyond our local community. Marcus called that evening while I was driving home, having seen a photo from the conference that someone had posted on social media. "Mom, I just saw a picture of you giving a presentation at some education conference. You looked so professional and confident. I had no idea you were doing things like that." It was intimidating, but also exciting. I'm discovering that I enjoy challenges I never would have considered attempting a few years ago. I'm so proud of you. And I'm grateful that you're pursuing things that make you happy instead of just focusing on what other people need from you. You deserve to have your own accomplishments and recognition. The conversation reminded me of how much our relationship had evolved since the dark period when his presence in my home had been a source of stress and resentment rather than connection and joy. We could now celebrate each other's successes without the complications of dependence and obligation that had previously characterized our interactions. As the year ended, I reflected on the remarkable changes that had occurred in my life since that terrible evening when I discovered Marcus and Crystal using my living room for their photography business. What had seemed like a devastating betrayal and the destruction of our family relationship had actually been the catalyst for growth and transformation that neither of us could have achieved while trapped in our old patterns of enablement and dependence. Marcus was thriving in Ohio, building a life based on honest work and healthy relationships. I was thriving in my hometown, developing expertise and leadership skills I'd never recognized I possessed. The knock on my door came at 7 in the morning, on a Tuesday in February. I wasn't expecting anyone, and the insistent pounding suggested urgency rather than a casual visit. Through the peephole, I saw Crystal standing on my front porch, looking thinner and more desperate than when she'd left my house 18 months earlier. I opened the door but kept the chain engaged, remembering the last time I'd been too trusting. Crystal looked terrible, hollow cheeks, dark circles under her eyes, clothes that hung loose on her diminished frame. Whatever had happened since she and Marcus parted ways, it hadn't been kind to her. "Mrs. Hartwell, I need to talk to you. Please, it's important." Her voice carried none of the entitled confidence I remembered. This was someone who'd been humbled by circumstances. "What do you want, Crystal?" "It's about Marcus. There are things you need to know, things that could hurt him if they come out the wrong way. Can I please come in? Just for a few minutes." Against my better judgment, I released the chain and let her into my living room.
She sat on the edge of my sofa like she might need to flee at any moment, her hands trembling slightly as she tried to arrange her thoughts. "Mrs. Hartwell, I know you hate me. I know what Marcus and I did in your house was wrong, and I know I treated you terribly when you kicked us out. But Marcus doesn't deserve what's about to happen to him." "What are you talking about?" Crystal pulled out a battered smartphone and showed me a series of screenshots. "Remember that content we were making? Well, some of it got uploaded to adult websites without our permission. Marcus's face is clearly visible in several videos, and someone just identified him. They've connected him to his current job in Ohio." My blood went cold as I realized what she was telling me. "Are you saying those videos are online?" "Not just online, they're tagged with his real name, and someone created a fake social media profile using his workplace information. His employers are probably going to find out soon, and so is his girlfriend. I thought you should know before it all explodes." The implications hit me like a physical blow. Marcus had spent 2 years rebuilding his reputation and self-respect, developing genuine relationships based on trust and honesty. Jennifer knew about his past mistakes in general terms, but she didn't know about the explicit content he'd created with Crystal. This revelation could destroy everything he'd worked to achieve. "Who did this? Who uploaded the videos?" Crystal's face flushed with embarrassment. "My ex-boyfriend Derek, the one Marcus and I were working with before we came to your house. He kept copies of everything, and when I broke up with him last month, he decided to get revenge by exposing everyone who'd ever been involved in his schemes." Derek. The name sent a chill through me as I remembered the manipulative man who'd convinced my son to participate in increasingly questionable activities. Apparently his vindictiveness extended beyond simple relationship drama. "What do you want from me, Crystal?"
I want to fix this before it destroys Marcus's life. Derek doesn't know about you or your connection to what happened. If we work together, maybe we can contain the damage. I studied her face, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. Crystal had proven herself untrustworthy in the past, and this sudden concern for Marcus's welfare seemed suspiciously convenient. But the fear in her eyes appeared genuine, and the consequences she described were certainly real enough. Why should I trust you after everything that happened? Because Marcus is the only decent person I've ever dated, and I ruined it by dragging him into Derek's schemes. I can't undo that, but maybe I can prevent Derek from destroying the good life Marcus has built since then. For the next hour, Crystal explained Derek's pattern of revenge against former partners and associates. He'd been systematically releasing explicit content featuring people who'd crossed him, always targeting their current employment and relationships for maximum damage. Several people had lost jobs, and at least one marriage had ended after similar exposures. The videos will keep spreading unless we can get Derek to remove them voluntarily. He's not responding to my calls, but he might listen if someone else approached him, someone he doesn't see as connected to the situation. You want me to contact this Derek person, not directly. I want you to hire a lawyer to send him a cease and desist letter. If it comes from legal representation, he might take it seriously. And if that doesn't work, we might need to consider other options. The conversation felt surreal. Less than 2 years ago, I'd thrown Crystal out of my house for violating my trust and boundaries. Now she was asking me to help protect Marcus from consequences that stemmed directly from his relationship with her. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. But beneath my resentment toward Crystal, I recognized a mother's obligation to protect her child from threats he couldn't handle alone. Marcus had no idea this storm was approaching, and he deserved the chance to prepare for it rather than being blindsided by his employer or girlfriend, discovering explicit content that featured him prominently. I'll make some calls, I said finally. But I want complete honesty from you about everything Derek has and what he's capable of doing with it. Crystal spent another 2 hours providing details about Derek's operation, the extent of the content he possessed, and the methods he'd used to damage other people's reputations. It was a sobering education in how personal information could be weaponized by someone with sufficient motivation and technical knowledge. After Crystal left, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee, trying to process the morning's revelations. Just when I'd thought Marcus's past mistakes were behind him, they'd returned in a form that could undo years of progress and personal growth. The unfairness of it was overwhelming. He'd learned from his errors, changed his behavior, and built a responsible life, only to face consequences for choices he'd made during his lowest period. I called the law firm that had handled Tom's estate and explained the situation in general terms. The attorney, Margaret Chen, was familiar with cyber harassment cases and agreed to draft a formal demand letter requiring Derek to remove the content and cease further distribution. She warned me that such letters weren't always effective, but they created a legal record that could be useful if stronger action became necessary. The hardest part was calling Marcus to warn him about the potential exposure. I'd promised myself I wouldn't insert myself into his problems anymore, but this was a threat he couldn't address without advance notice. He deserved the opportunity to control how Jennifer and his employers learned about his past, rather than discovering it through online searches or workplace gossip. "Mom, what's wrong?" Marcus asked immediately when he heard my voice. "You never call on weekday mornings." "Crystal came to see me today. There's something you need to know about those videos you made with her." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally Marcus spoke, his voice carefully controlled. "What about them?" I explained the situation as gently as possible, watching through my kitchen window, as normal life continued in the neighborhood, while my son's world potentially collapsed 2 states away. Marcus listened without interrupting, asking only clarifying questions about timelines and legal options. "How much does Jennifer know about this part of my past?" I asked when I'd finished explaining the threat. "Nothing specific. I told her Crystal and I had made some questionable content together, but I didn't go into details about what kind or how explicit it was. I was planning to have that conversation eventually, but I wanted to wait until our relationship was more established." "You need to tell her now, before someone else does." She deserves to hear it from you, and she deserves the chance to decide how to handle it with her employer if the content surfaces. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. What if she leaves me? What if this destroys everything I've built here? Then you'll rebuild again, just like you did after leaving my house. You're not the same person who made those videos, Marcus. Anyone who knows you now can see that. But you have to give people the chance to make informed decisions about supporting you through this. We talked for another few minutes about practical steps, contacting his supervisor to give advance warning, speaking honestly with Jennifer, preparing for the possibility that the legal approach wouldn't stop Derek's harassment. Throughout the conversation, Marcus sounded frightened but determined, like someone facing a difficult challenge rather than a hopeless victim. After we hung up, I realized something had shifted in our relationship during this crisis. Instead of feeling responsible for fixing Marcus's problem or guilty about my inability to prevent it, I felt like a supportive ally helping him navigate a situation he'd ultimately have to handle himself. The boundary between his problems and my responsibilities had held firm even under pressure. Margaret Chen's letter was sent within 48 hours, demanding that Derek remove all content featuring Marcus and providing legal justification for the request. Her cover letter to me was cautiously optimistic. Derek's operation appeared to be unsophisticated, and he might comply, rather than risk legal complications. Meanwhile, Marcus was handling the personal relationships that could be affected by the exposure. He called me Friday evening to report on his conversations with Jennifer and his supervisor at the factory. Jennifer was upset, but not for the reasons I expected, he said. She was angry that Derek was trying to hurt me, and she was worried about how this might affect my job and reputation. She never questioned whether she wanted to stay with me or suggested that I deserved whatever happened. And your supervisor, that was harder. Frank had prepared me for the conversation, and Mr. Rodriguez listened to the whole explanation without interrupting. He said he'd have to discuss it with upper management, but he appreciated the advance warning and the fact that I was being proactive about addressing it. The relief in Marcus's voice was audible. The conversations he'd dreaded had resulted in support rather than rejection, confirmation that the life he'd built in Ohio was strong enough to withstand challenges from his past. Derek's response to the legal demand came the following week, not through his attorney, but through escalated harassment. Instead of removing the content, he'd created additional social media profiles featuring Marcus's information and had begun contacting his employer directly, with links to the explicit material. Margaret Chen was unsurprised by the escalation. Men like Derek don't respond well to legal pressure. He's trying to cause as much damage as possible before we can get a court order to stop him. The good news is that his behavior is creating a stronger case for harassment charges. But court orders took time, and Derek was moving quickly to maximize the damage. Marcus called me Tuesday evening with news that his employer had placed him on administrative leave, pending an investigation into whether the explicit content violated company policies about employee conduct. I might lose my job, Mom. 2 years of building credibility and proving myself, and it could all disappear because of videos I made during the worst period of my life. What does Frank think about the situation? Frank and Dorothy are furious, but not at me. Dorothy actually called Derek's phone number and left a voicemail telling him exactly what she thought of men who attack people for entertainment. Frank contacted a few other employers in the area to see if they'd be willing to hire me if things don't work out at the factory. The image of Dorothy Kowalski defending Marcus made me smile despite the seriousness of the situation. He'd found surrogate parents who were as protective and supportive as Tom and I had been, but who also maintained the boundaries that encouraged his independence and growth. Over the next 2 weeks, the crisis played out in ways that revealed both the damage Derek could cause and the strength of the life Marcus had built. The factory ultimately decided not to terminate him, but he was required to undergo counseling sessions about workplace conduct and social media responsibility. Several people in his small town discovered the content and made his life temporarily uncomfortable with whispers and pointed stares. But the support outweighed the criticism. Jennifer stood by him publicly and privately, making it clear that she judged him by his current character rather than his past mistakes. Frank and Dorothy treated him with the same respect and affection they'd always shown, helping him navigate both the practical and emotional challenges of the situation. Most surprisingly, several coworkers who learned about Derek's harassment expressed sympathy rather than judgment, with a few sharing their own stories of past mistakes that could have been used against them under similar circumstances. The experience taught Marcus that most people were more understanding and forgiving than he'd expected, particularly when someone was clearly being victimized by vindictive harassment. The legal resolution came in March when Derek was arrested on unrelated fraud charges that made him a poor candidate for fighting harassment lawsuits. Faced with potential additional criminal charges for cyber harassment, he agreed to remove all content featuring Marcus and to cease further distribution or promotion of such material. Margaret Chen was satisfied with the outcome, though she warned that the content might resurface through other sources, since it had been widely distributed during the peak of Derek's campaign. The legal remedy only addresses future harassment, not the permanent nature of anything that's been posted online. Marcus seemed to understand that complete erasure was impossible, but was grateful for the reduction in active targeting. Most importantly, he'd learned that his current life was strong enough to withstand challenges from his past, and that the people who mattered most would judge him by his present character rather than his former mistakes. "Mom, I want to thank you for helping me through this," he said during our Sunday call in late March. "I know it wasn't easy to work with Crystal or get involved in legal action, especially after everything that happened before. You're my son, Marcus. That means I'll always help you handle threats you can't manage alone, but I'm proud that you took responsibility for the personal relationships and handled those conversations yourself. I learned that from you. When you kicked me out of your house, it forced me to discover I was capable of more than I'd believed. This situation taught me the same lesson in a different way. I don't have to be ashamed of my past as long as I'm committed to being better in the future." The crisis had tested everything Marcus had learned about responsibility, honesty, and relationships, and he'd passed that test by facing the problem directly, rather than running from it or expecting someone else to solve it for him. More importantly, he'd discovered that the life he'd built was resilient enough to survive challenges that would have destroyed the unstable foundation he'd constructed during his years of schemes and dependence. As spring arrived, our family settled into a new normal that incorporated the lessons learned from both Marcus's growth and the recent crisis. He visited monthly now, often bringing Jennifer, and our conversations reflected the mutual respect that had developed between two adults who'd learned to support each other without enabling unhealthy dependence. Crystal had disappeared again, after helping with the Derek situation, but not before apologizing genuinely for her role in the problems that had affected our family. Her assistance during the crisis had been motivated by guilt rather than affection, but it had demonstrated that even people who'd caused significant damage could sometimes choose to mitigate the harm they'd created. The experience reminded me that parenting never truly ends, but it does evolve. My role in Marcus's life had shifted from manager to advisor, from enabler to supporter, from someone who solved his problems to someone who helped him develop the capabilities to solve problems himself. The change had been painful for both of us, but it had ultimately produced the healthy adult relationship we'd both wanted, but hadn't known how to create. On a warm evening in April, as I worked in my garden planting flowers that would bloom throughout the summer, I reflected on the journey our family had traveled from the crisis that had begun with Crystal and Marcus living in my house. What had seemed like devastating betrayal and family breakdown had actually been the beginning of growth and healing that neither of us could have achieved without being forced to confront uncomfortable truths about our relationship patterns. Marcus was thriving in Ohio with a job he respected, a woman who appreciated his growth, and surrogate parents who provided guidance without enabling dependence. I was thriving in my hometown with meaningful volunteer work, genuine friendships, and the deep satisfaction that comes from discovering capabilities you never knew you possessed. We maintained our connection through regular communication and visits that were based on choice rather than obligation. The house around me was quiet but not lonely, filled with the peaceful contentment that comes from creating a life that reflects your authentic priorities and interests. The living room where I'd once discovered Marcus and Crystal making explicit content was now a space where I entertained friends, worked on painting projects, and enjoyed the simple pleasure of reading in comfortable solitude. Sometimes the best gift you can give someone you love is the refusal to enable their worst impulses, even when that refusal causes temporary pain and conflict. Marcus had needed to discover his own capabilities and develop his own motivation for growth, and I had needed to remember that my worth wasn't measured by my usefulness to other people's dreams and schemes. We'd both learned that love without boundaries isn't really love, it's codependence disguised as affection. Real love sometimes requires difficult choices and uncomfortable conversations, but it ultimately produces relationships based on mutual respect rather than need and manipulation. The crisis that had started with my son bringing his girlfriend to live in my house without permission had ended with both of us living authentic, independent lives that we'd chosen rather than simply accepted. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.